It's my pleasure to introduce Megan Barrett, who is here to give an entoLIVE about insect welfare. Over to you, Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Megan Barrett. I'm an assistant professor at Indiana University, Indianapolis, and director of the Insect Welfare Research Society, and NSF co-PI at the Center for Environmental Sustainability through Insect Farming as well. My background is in insect neuroscience and physiology, but I now work a lot on insect welfare, especially in farmed and research settings. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to briefly dip our toes in what an insect is. I know a lot of you out there are already experts in this, but I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. I'm then going to talk a little bit about some of the evidence for insect sentience, introduce the concept of welfare, and talk about 3 examples of insect welfare in the wild, on the farm, and in research settings. Okay, so let's start here with what an insect is. And I like to start with this because I think there's a lot of common assumptions about what it means to be an insect or what insects are like. And those assumptions can sometimes get in the way of us being receptive to real facts about the neurobiology and behavior of these organisms and their bearing on the potential for sentience in this highly diverse group of animals. So here is our phylogeny of all the animals in the world. They come from a common ancestor, the ancestor of all the metazoa. That's where we are. That red arrow is pointing to the chordates, and that blue arrow that just appeared at the top of the screen is to the arthropods. The insects are nested within that group. So arthropods are the majority of invertebrate diversity. There are many super cool terrestrial arthropods that are not insects that I am not talking about today. That includes spiders, which are chelicerates, millipedes and centipedes, which are myriapods, roly-polies, actually, I don't know what you call them, pill bugs, something else. You probably call them something else in the UK. Those are also not going to be insects. Our insects are this group up here, our most derived group of arthropods, and with crustaceans as their closest relatives. And they are a highly diverse group of animals. There are 1 million described species, 5.5 million estimated species to exist. And what that means is that when we say the word insect, we're largely talking just about a taxonomic label. There are very few things that all these organisms share in common across all of their life stages. Every time you think you found a rule, you usually have found an exception. So that means that there's tremendous variation in lifespan, behavior, cognitive abilities, physiology, and more. As you can see, just one example of that are these beautiful photos of ant faces, and there's obviously just tremendous morphological diversity in that series of pictures. So one thing that people tend to say that kind of makes it feel implausible to them that insects might have experiences is that insects are all really small. But those of you who are familiar with insects probably know that that is not true. Although there are many very small insects, there are also many moderately sized insects, and there are even many insects that get very large. A couple of examples of those very large insects are on this slide: the giant weta from New Zealand, the Lord Howe stick insect, Megachile pluto, one of the world's largest bees, and beetles in particular often take the cake for being the largest, the longest, the heaviest, whatever. In particular, this one species that actually weighs the equivalent of a female rat and about 900 to 2,000% the mass of a house mouse. People also tend to think that because insects are small, they must have small and unsophisticated neuroanatomy, and that also is not going to be true. And it's not really true no matter which level of brain organization you're looking at. So first, we could consider brain mass between vertebrates and insects. Turns out insects can actually have larger brains by brain mass compared to some vertebrates. The largest insect brain that's been studied to date is 11.7 milligrams in mass. That is from a wasp species, a solitary wasp. The smallest vertebrate brain that has been studied to date is the Algerian sand gecko. It weighs in at 11.3 milligrams. If you're somebody who doesn't really care about geckos, but you care about mammals, the smallest mammal that has been studied to date is the Etruscan shrew, and its brain weighs about 64.4 milligrams, which is about 6-fold larger than that insect brain. I'll also note that that wasp is the largest we've studied to date. It only weighs 0.55 grams, so plausibly there are much larger insects that would have larger brain masses that have yet to be studied that would make those numbers even more comparable. But you might think brain mass, probably not the most relevant level of organization. What about neuron number? The smallest vertebrate, again, that Algerian sand gecko, and the largest insect studied to date both have about 1.77 million neurons in their brains. The smallest mammal that's been studied to date is the eusocial naked mole rat. That has 27 million neurons, which is about 15-fold larger than that largest insect. We see substantially larger differences in neuron number, even just within the mammals. For example, between the naked mole rat and an elephant, we see, I think it's a 10,000-fold difference or so in neuron number. So just to note that there can be many insects that have larger and even comparable numbers of neurons to vertebrates. Also, those brains can be complex in their connectivity, which is another important potential thing to keep in mind when it comes to whether or not nervous systems are going to be able to produce subjective experience, like we'll talk more about later. So the first connectome of an insect brain was completed in 2020 in this Lee et al. 2020 publication. And in that paper, they actually found evidence for direct connections between sensory integrated brain regions called the mushroom bodies and the central complex in the adult Drosophila melanogaster or fruit fly brain. Those kinds of direct connections are expected to be important for potentially producing subjective experience in vertebrates. And so we might think that they're important in invertebrates as well. I think the last kind of bug bust myth that I want to do, or bug myth that I want to bust, is going to be about insect behaviors and their lives. People think insects, they're living these really short, hyper unsophisticated lives. They wouldn't have any need for experience. They can just be little reflex machines, right? All these examples that just popped up on the slide are some of my favorite examples of the diverse and interesting ways that insects live their lives, some of which, of course, can be very short, like mayflies, some of which can be very long, like, eusocial termite kings and queens or queen ants. So I'm going to talk about just a couple example of those that are really exciting to me, keeping in mind that, there's a diversity of these behaviors. Not all groups do all of these behaviors, and there are many more behaviors I didn't even get to cover. One of my favorites is monogamous pair bonding for up to 20 years. That's been documented in queen and king termites founding their nests together. But there's also maternal and paternal care as well as biparental care in solitary insects too. Another favorite is rescue and wound treatment behaviors, particularly in ants. There was a great study that came out last year from Eric Frank's lab. In Florida, they work on Camponotus carpenter ants, and they showed that ants are actually the only species other than humans to do medically relevant amputations on the limbs of their injured nestmates. There's facial recognition in wasps that allows them to identify individual members of their colony, and there's emotion-like states, including studies on chronic pain, anxiety, and depression in fruit flies, which are a biomedical research organism for those kinds of phenomenon in humans. So why did I start with this information? Mostly because I wanted to make 2 points. First, that insects are a really diverse group with a lot of surprising cognitive abilities and life history strategies. Hopefully, even those of you who know a lot about bugs learned at least one new bug fact in the last few minutes. And so what that means is that we should be suspicious of our intuitions about insects. We should be suspicious of the assumptions that we may make about their simplicity, either in lifestyle or their simplicity neurobiologically, because those kinds of intuitions might not always be right, and the information that we have may not always be correct. So, for example, it was often stated that insects lacked those direct connections between the mushroom body and the central complex until they were found with the first connectome in 2020. If you're interested in more really fun stories about bugs that I wish I could spend all day today talking about, you can instead listen to this 2 hour long podcast episode I did recently with 80,000 hours, where I just kind of go off about my favorite bug facts for a really long time. Okay, so great, Meghan. You've told me lots of cool things about bugs. We're all on the same page about loving them, but are they sentient? That's kind of one of the key features to this talk. So the ethical question at hand is this: what traits cause us to morally consider the welfare of others? And here on this slide, I have 2 images, and plausibly, if I walked up to one of them and gave it a good hard kick, you would be horrified, and if I did the same to the other, you would not even notice. And so you've already landed on a trait in your mind that is causing you to morally consider the welfare of one of these images and not the other one of these images. My guess is that it is not cuteness or roundness or the presence of eyes, because both of these things have those characteristics. Instead, you've probably landed on something that mirrors this quote by Jeremy Bentham in 1789. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? We are worried about the welfare of the mouse because we are worried it will suffer in response to my kick, and we are not worried in the same way about the rock. So when we think about whether or not we morally consider the welfare of other beings, that capacity to suffer, that feeling or experience of pain, tends to be what we're thinking about in many moral theories. So that means we need to know when organisms are capable of experiencing pain. And to do that, we need to first distinguish between 2 very interrelated but separate phenomenon. The first is nociception, which is a reflexive response to a noxious stimulus. So imagine you reach your hand out and you touch a hot stove. The sensory cells in your fingertip will send a signal up to your spinal cord will send a signal back down to your motor neuron, and you will pull your hand away before you've even felt the experience of pain at all. Now, at the same time, your spinal cord is sending a signal up to your brain proper, and that is where you will feel the pain of the burn. You will cradle your hand and say, ouch, and go for the burn gel. So the reflexive response to the stove and the subjective experience of the pain are distinct phenomena from each other that need to be separated. And we tend to care morally about the subjective experience and not as much about the reflexive response to noxious stimulation. Now, the challenge with subjective experience is that we can't objectively assess it, right? It's inherently subjective. And so in the past, we've tended to rely on self-report as our way of understanding which other organisms might plausibly be sentient and have subjective experience. Now, the problem with relying on self-report is that it biases us against any animals that can't engage in self-report, like, for example, dogs. And by self-report, I mean literally speaking aloud the words, I am experiencing pain, not like a yelp or a howl, just like literally reporting the exact subjective experience. So dogs, of course, are not able to engage in that level of self-report. And there was a period of time in which it was thought that dogs were just reflexive machines that were responding to noxious stimulation in a nociceptive way. They were often described while being vivisected. You know, the howling, the kicking, the screaming was just described as the mechanical response like a cuckoo on the hour, a cuckoo clock chiming on the hour. Plausibly today, we think that was a moral mistake to vivisect those dogs without any anesthesia or analgesia, and we would want to avoid similar kinds of moral mistakes. So what we would want is some set of objective proxies that raise or lower our certainty that a particular group of animals feels pain. And the more of those proxies that are met, the more plausible it is they have subjective experience and we should treat them cautiously. And the less of those proxies they meet, the less likely it is that they are sentient and the less likely we need to treat them cautiously. So that set of objective evidence is not definitive. It does not prove subjective experience is there. It just suggests it's more likely or less likely so that we can make decisions about how to morally consider other kinds of beings. So we tend to draw the evidence for these kinds of proxy-based approaches from two major areas: neurobiology, because as I demonstrated to you earlier with my example with the hot stove, neurobiology is the substrate of pain experience, and behavior, because we think pain probably evolved for a reason, and so there must be fitness-relevant behavioral outputs of the experience of pain for animals evolutionarily. And using those broad categories of evidence, we've gotten some consensus on these animals, right? We can't prove that they are sentient, but we think it is very plausible that they are sentient based on the evidence that we've looked at so far in neurobiology and behavior. But what about these animals, right? Our hyperdiverse insects. So let's take a look at this framework here together. This framework was produced by Jonathan Birch's group in 2021. You might have actually heard him come talk on cephalopods recently. So this framework has 4 neurobiological and 4 behavioral criteria. The neurobiology are first, the behavioral are second, and it's a taxonomically neutral framework that can be used to assess the potential for sentience in any group of animals. So essentially, this particular framework is, again, a precautionary framework. It's not definitively proving sentience. So if you have all 8, it doesn't mean, yep, 100% for sure you're sentient. It just means we have strong evidence to be cautious in regard to that group of animals. So this framework was developed, like I said, by Jonathan Birch at London School of Economics in 2021 in response to a call by DEFRA. They were interested in assessing the evidence for sentience in cephalopods and decapods. And if you're interested, by the way, in the difference between like a precautionary framework and a definitive framework and why we might want precautionary frameworks, I'd encourage you to check out the Fisher et al. 2025 link at the bottom, where we kind of go through the difference between those two kinds of frameworks and why precautionary frameworks are so valuable. Okay, so if we use this precautionary framework, how does the more accepted invertebrate case stack up under the use of this framework? So cephalopods, or octopuses as they're more commonly called, are one of the more accepted invertebrate cases. People tend to think that there's a decent amount of neurobiological and behavioral evidence that these species likely have some kind of consciousness and some kind of subjective experience, as recognized in the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness in 2012. Under this framework of 8 criteria, they are meeting 7 of 8 criteria to a high or very high degree of confidence, which this framework rates as very strong evidence for sentience. Now, when we look at another group that you might be very familiar with, your true crabs, those are going to meet 5 of 8 criteria to a high or very high degree of confidence, which this framework rates as strong evidence for sentience. And importantly, to the UK context in particular, on the basis of this report, the UK government included both of these groups in their Animal Sentience Bill in 2022, which could lead to further protections for these animals down the line, but minimally says this is a legislatively relevant number of criterion to fulfill to merit some kind of legal recognition of sentience in those species. So, along with Jonathan Birch's group, to ensure we had consistency with the prior data, and led by this fantastic postdoc, Matilda Gibbons, who was in, at the time, Lars Chicka's lab at Queen Mary University, London, we went through and we used these same criteria to assess 6 orders of insects. We did this separately at the adult and the juvenile life stage. What I will say is that for juveniles, essentially, people don't research them, and so it just was a whole table of very low, no research found one way or the other. But we can say some more things about adults, and they are summarized in this table here. So we looked at Blatodia, Coleoptera, Diptera, Hymenoptera, Lepidoptera, and Orthoptera. I think one of the kind of stellar results to me has just been highlighted in blue. So that's showing the Blitodia, which is our cockroaches and termites, and the Diptera, which are our flies and mosquitoes, meet 6 of 8 criteria to a high or very high degree of confidence, with the remaining 2 criteria not showing as negative, they're showing as very low, no research found, which means no one has studied that criterion at all in any species in that order that we could find as of 2022. So those 2 groups are one above the true crabs, one below the cephalopods, at least at the adult life stage. Another interesting thing for those of you up to date on your insect phylogeny is that those are actually split across the holometabolous and hemimetabolous divide in insect developmental strategy. So those groups are not like clustered really close together, which could suggest that many of these criterion are kind of like broadly applicable across many of the insects. That's a possible implication of that. You may be thinking, wait a minute, cockroaches and flies, those are not the 2 groups I would have predicted would be the most sentient. And it's true that this doesn't actually mean, again, they're the most sentient or even the most likely to be sentient. They're simply the groups for which we have the most evidence for these 8 criterion that are proxies for the possibility of sentience. We can only put a yes, they meet it to high or very high degree of confidence in criterion where there has been some research. Both of these groups are studied and have been studied for a very long time in response to their nociceptive neurobiology and nociceptive behavior. So you may be familiar, the American cockroach has been a kind of model system for nociceptive neurobiology since the 1960s or so. And so we just have a lot of information about their responses to noxious stimulation neurobiologically and behaviorally. And of course, the fruit fly is studied for all and sundry, but includes chronic pain and acute pain research, as well as analgesic screening research in biomedical applications. In addition, I added a few yellow stars. Those are just areas where in my casual reading of this literature since 2022, new research has since come out. The Hymenoptera is the group that I think really surprises people. They expect for there to be more evidence in the Hymenoptera than what we found, which is 4 of 8. And again, there's lots of amazing cognition research happening in the Hymenoptera, but cognition and sentience are a distinct phenomenon, and there's been less research into sentience in that group of animals compared to cognition. Okay, now essentially what that means is that there's enough evidence for sentience in at least 2 groups of insects at the adult life stage to be cautious. And this is something that I think actually many in the research community are starting to realize. So over here on the left side of the screen is a survey of animal behavior researchers by Zippel et al. Last year, and they show that 67% of animal behavior researchers ascribe emotions to at least some insects. That's the light yellow, light green, and dark green parts of that graph. And a survey that I conducted last year of the Royal Entomological Society and Entomological Society of America memberships showed that entomologists were 11 times more likely to care about insect welfare because of the intrinsic value of the animal versus not caring about insect welfare. And this has been recognized also in some recent consensus or other kinds of statements. So the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness is a follow-up to the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness in 2012. And this document essentially said that there is plausible evidence for sentience or evidence that sentience is plausible in at least some insects. As well, the Royal Entomological Society last year released a statement on the ethical treatment of insects in research, noting that there is significant uncertainty about an animal's sentience, like insect sentience, and that precedent suggests adopting research practices that minimize the risk of unnecessary harm. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Okay, so we've introduced insects, we've talked about some evidence for sentience, we've said that it is uncertain but plausible in at least some insects. When evidence is uncertain but plausible, a precautionary perspective would suggest that we should afford some care to minimize harm where we can. And to do that, we need to know about the welfare of those animals so we know what harms to minimize. So what is welfare, that word that I'm using? So welfare is the positive or negative experience of an animal. It includes consideration of the physical state, but also the mental state, and in particular, how the physical state bears on the mental state. And what that means is that welfare is a property of the individual animal, not the health or productivity of a population or species of animals. So probably here at the Biological Recording Company, you've heard a lot of talks about insect population declines, and those are super important to be discussing. That is not the same concept as welfare. So welfare, we're talking about how each individual animal, each individual insect is doing from its own perspective. Now, welfare science then is going to be the study of the physical and mental well-being of individual animals. And we take evidence for how animals feel from a couple of different categories or buckets of data. The first is their physiological well-being. So things like their health status. Are they diseased? Are they injured or not? Things like their behavioral expression. Can they engage in rewarding behaviors, or are they having behaviors restricted that then frustrate them? And their environmental conditions. Are the things that they need available to them? Do they have shelter? Do they have nutrition? Those kinds of considerations can also bear on how animals may feel. And this framework, I think, does a really good job of summarizing the way that we might think about animal welfare. This is the 5 domains framework posited by Miller and Reed originally in 1994. And it has these 4 physical or functional domains that are observable, measurable categories that then inform the likely mental domain of the animal, which informs ultimately their welfare level. It considers both positive and negative experiences with the goal of providing overall more positive than negative, thus providing an animal with a life worth living. This is used frequently in the assessment of farmed animal welfare. So just to go through one example, say for nutrition, we have negative nutrition as deprivation of food, water, or malnourishment. Positive nutrition is appropriate and available food. We could imagine that if an animal is being deprived of food and water, it might be experiencing hunger as one of its negative mental affective states. We might think if that animal is instead provided with appropriate and available nutrition, that it would have the positive experience of being satiated. So that's one way that you can use this kind of a framework to assess the kinds of experiences that animals may have. Note that actually cognition is really important here, because you might think for the behavioral category, more cognitively sophisticated animals have more behaviors they might need to be able to perform or express, and might have more negative experiences from those behaviors being frustrated. Okay, so that's welfare. So now let's take that and go to 3 different case studies, one in the wild, one on the farm, and one in research. So first, how many insects are out there? So the Smithsonian Institute estimates there are 10 quintillion insects alive in the wild at any moment in time. And so if we imagine that we started, we froze time in this 1 second that we've been talking, we froze time and we wanted to count all 10 quintillion of the insects that were alive in that frozen moment. Let's imagine we could count 10 per second. How long would we be counting for? We would be counting for 31.68 billion years. We would count from now all the way back to the Big Bang, from the Big Bang to the current time, and from now until many billions of years into the future, just to count the insects that were alive in that frozen moment of time. It is an astronomical number of insects that are living their lives in the wild each day. There are many possible welfare concerns for wild insects, just like other wild groups of animals. If you've ever attended a wild animal welfare talk, these will not be surprising. There are welfare concerns associated with natural conditions, things like starvation, predation events, adverse conditions, parasitism, and there are anthropogenic concerns, so things that we are likely to cause. That could be things like pesticide application, harvesting and transport, pollution, habitat loss, and more. I'll focus in very quickly on a case study on pesticides on cropland. So some quick math on that, and this is a real back of the envelope calculation. So keep in mind that this is a bit speculative, but we're just going to throw some numbers in and see where they land. Globally, agricultural land area is approximately 5 billion hectares, 38% of our land, and about a third of that is used for cropland, so that's 16.5 trillion meters squared. There are not robust estimates for how many soil-dwelling insects are living in agricultural cropland, and of course it varies based on lots of factors, but there are some estimates for how many soil-dwelling insects are found in other kinds of ecosystems, and they're showing us about 1 to 3,000 individuals per meter squared. I'll also note that those are insects-ish, because often they are including other groups of arthropods that are not springtails and mites in those calculations, so it's including everybody but those guys. So insects-ish, 1 to 3,000 individuals per meter squared. If we take all those numbers and we math them up, we're going to get 34 quadrillion potentially impacted directly annually on cropland through pesticide application. And a company that also works on humane pest management strategies, Monarch Crops, actually recently did a research report that came to a very similar number. So 34 quadrillion insects potentially impacted directly by pesticides on cropland. Now, what are some of the welfare relevant consequences of pesticide application? One is going to be obviously the lethality, right? They are dying from that. That may induce some pain for them through the process of death. Depending on what kind of theorist you are, you may think of death as a welfare harm or not. But that's kind of just order number 1 effects, because of course there's a lot of sublethal effects for animals that are not directly killed by the pesticides. And as you might imagine from that last slide, you saw there's a lot of wind blowing a lot of those pesticides into, say, the forest behind that plane. There are going to be insects that are sublethally affected outside of the 34 quadrillion number that I already cited you. How many of those we don't know, but they can be impacted in a variety of ways. So we know that some of the sublethal effects of pesticides are things like nervous system issues, myocardial, which essentially is heart cell dysfunction, impaired flight, reduced muscle efficiency, which makes flight harder and more energetically expensive, developmental issues, reproductive abnormalities, impaired immune function that makes it more likely for them to get diseases, and ultimately those tend to, culminate in decreased longevity for those individuals. So a variety of physical health related problems for insects, as well as potential for behavioral restriction as a result of some of these nervous system issues and reduced flight efficiency. It is possible we might be able to mitigate some of these harms that we are directly responsible for through pesticide application while still meeting other goals. So you should not take this part of the talk as me saying, oh, insects experience welfare concerns when we spray pesticides, so we shouldn't spray any pesticides, and we should all starve to death, or we shouldn't treat disease or anything like that. That would be a very odd conclusion to come to. Instead, what we're talking about is mitigating harms while still meeting other goals like human nutrition or disease management. Some potential options include things like refining the dosages of pesticide used, the timing of their application, using pesticides that are species specific instead of neurotoxins that impact all insects, using insect repellents instead of insecticides, using application methods that reduce the likelihood of sublethal exposure, and substantially more. Now, obviously, for those of you who work closely with agricultural scientists, you know that for each crop system, each crop type, each pest type, each ecosystem, we're going to need to do research on each of those systems to understand what is feasible and what isn't feasible of these suggestions and many more that could potentially improve the welfare of insects on cropland in response to pesticide application. So substantially more research is needed, but one thing that I guess I'll say is that I've seen some very creative scientists in vector and disease management start to take insect welfare more seriously, and it's led them to some really novel approaches that could also be good for biodiversity. And so I would be excited to see a welfare lens taken alongside lenses about protecting the environment and protecting human interests to make sure that we are mitigating unnecessary harms while also meeting our other goals as we technologically continue to advance in our agricultural and disease management systems. Okay, so that's one example in the wild. I actually don't work much on wild insect welfare, but I think it's always good to give one example of that. I'm going to talk a little bit now about more what I specialize on, which is insect welfare in farms and in research settings. So insects are farmed as food and feed. If you're not familiar with this industry, it's a new and rapidly growing industry predicated on the fact that insects are a viable protein source. Some of you may have tried them, some of you may have not. Insects are viable for human consumption. There are at least 2,000 species of edible insects that we know of. They're also viable for farm vertebrate animal consumption, fish, chickens, etc. All eat insects as a part of their natural diet, as do humans. They may be a more sustainable source of protein compared to farmed vertebrates. You can read more about that and some of the discussions about sustainability in the paper that I've just put down below by Cecilia Lalander and another great team of people who have been working on this industry. This is generally most true if they're eaten directly by humans and replacing vertebrate animals, or if they're fed specific waste feeds that otherwise would not be reclaimed. Importantly, they can improve food security in protein-poor areas where access to protein regularly is not common, and it is a global industry. I won't have a lot of time to talk about that today, but just know there's a tremendous amount of variation in the practices that are used, the degree of automation, the scale of the facilities, what insects are at the heart of the industry. All of that can vary, and we won't have time to cover it. So again, we want to know the scale, how many animals, how many individuals are involved in this industry, because again, we care about the welfare on the individual level. So each individual counts. And so the current scale of the industry, as you can see, is hovering somewhere around 2.5 trillion animals farmed each year from this report. And the other thing that you can see from this graphic is just how new the industry is. So really, it just starts to actually kind of uptick in like the 2015 to 2020 zone. We get the barest number of billions of farmed animals, and then it starts to rocket up from there on out. And this is mostly, these numbers are mostly comprised of two species, black soldier flies and yellow mealworms. Now, this is the predicted scale of the industry as of 2033. So on the left graphic, you can see the number of animals that were slaughtered in 2023, looking at broiler chickens in dark gray at the bottom, fish in yellow, then shrimp in dark blue, and then insects, just the two species I mentioned, black soldier flies and yellow mealworms, in light blue. So insects in 2023 were already the majority of farmed animals. However, by 2033, you can see they will be the vast majority of farmed animals. And so that's one reason why people are really interested in insect welfare, because unlike for fish, for shrimp, and for chickens, there are no legislated or other standard operating procedures, or even really much empirical knowledge about insect welfare in the insects as food and feed industry. So in 2022, I did this case study in farm black soldier fly welfare with my colleagues Stefan Young-Chia, Bob Fisher, and Jeff Tomberlin, who is a leading expert in black soldier fly biology that we were very grateful to have work on this paper with us. And so this particular paper, we essentially went through and wanted to understand what are the kinds of issues that black soldier flies might be facing when farmed as food and feed. And this was published in the Journal of Insects as Food and Feed then. So to introduce you to black soldier fly farming, before we get into the actual welfare stuff, essentially black soldier flies are amazing recyclers of decaying organic matter. So you can feed them a wide variety of waste substrates. So you'll source some kind of organic waste, you'll process it to make it safe for them to consume it. That might mean adding water or removing water, those kinds of things. Then you treat it by either letting eggs hatch onto it or putting baby larvae called neonates onto the feed. They will eat that feed very, very quickly. And then after a period of a few weeks, you will harvest them, usually by sieving them out of the substrate. A subset of them you will let turn into pupa, which is essentially like the chrysalis stage for caterpillars, where they're undergoing metamorphosis. So you'll let them pupate and then turn into adult flies. Those adult flies breed and are used as a population that makes more eggs to restart your colony cycle. The rest of them will then be slaughtered and they will be turned into your product, whether that's protein, oil, chitin to be extracted, etc. So that's the kind of farming process for black soldier flies. This is what it looks like in practice. These are facilities or pictures from JM Green, which is a facility no longer active in China. But essentially, each of these blue totes that are stacked 4 across by 5 high by 2 deep, each of those holds 10,000 black soldier fly larvae. And you can see the pallets go all the way down. This is the adult breeding facility. So each of these cages, you can see the little black dots. Those are all going to be breeding adults in those cages. They are not photophobic, so they're attracted to those lights, which help them engage in mating behaviors while in captivity. Okay, so we looked at the scientific literature on black soldier flies, and we tried to understand what things could affect black soldier fly welfare. Now, if any of you have been around the insect welfare literature, you know it's extremely new and very few people have studied it. So there was very little data on individual or sublethal welfare in farmed insects. That meant that we were instead relying on population level mortality as an indicator. Now, what that means is that typically when lots of individuals are dying, the welfare of those individuals is not high. The opposite is not necessarily true. Just because lots of individuals are surviving, it doesn't mean that they're thriving. So we can get a sense with this approach of what the absolute worst conditions are. We can't get a sense of what the best conditions are. So that's a limitation of this kind of approach, and we need a lot more data to understand positive welfare in insects as a result. But even with this limited approach, we were able to identify some kind of major welfare concerns for farmed black soldier flies that needed research to address them. And I'll walk you through just one of those today. I do also work on slaughter and stunning processes, but today I'm going to talk to you about food being provided to adult black soldier flies. So currently in black soldier fly farming facilities, adults are typically not provided with any food. They may be provided with water, but no food. And this is probably because of a misreading of a publication by Shepard et al. In 2002, where they pioneered the rearing of black soldier flies indoors. And they wrote, no food was offered to adults and was not required for successful reproduction. The large store of fat provided by the larva apparently reduced or eliminated the necessity of adult feeding. So what that literally means is adults will reproduce without feeding first. What it was taken to mean as is adults cannot eat. They cannot consume nutrients. However, that is not true. Adult black soldier flies have functional mouth parts. That red arrow is pointing to them. Those functional mouth parts link up to a functional digestive system that does not atrophy during the pupal stage, as in other insects that do not feed at the adult life stage, like silkworm moths don't feed at the adult life stage and their digestive system atrophies. That does not happen in adult black soldier flies. That digestive system contains all the enzymes required for carbohydrate and protein catalysis. If you feed them food, they gravitate towards it, consume it, and live longer as a result, as you'll see. So to get a handle on what we should feed them, now that we know that they eat, we just asked, what do they like to eat? What do they prefer if we give them some options? So these data are showing that black soldier fly adults prefer molasses over things like dextrose and honey. Dextrose is just white sugar. And then they prefer yeast strongly over agar and casein as a protein source. So those are two things that they are preferring. We also asked them, in what amounts do you prefer? By giving them access to a variety of different solutions with different concentrations of yeast and molasses. So we found that they prefer a 1:4 to 1:8 yeast to molasses ratio, which is actually pretty common for other fly nutritional work as well, and that they prefer the carbohydrate be standard at a 5% in solution. So 5% molasses, 1.25% yeast, and the rest is going to be water. Now, when we feed them, they live substantially longer when we feed them this preferred diet. So males and females fed only water are shown with the dashed lines. The food condition is shown using solid lines, and you can see the longevity profile of these flies in those two cases, where we're getting about a 25% increase in longevity for fed flies of both males in blue and females in pink. So they do live longer when they're provided with food and not just water. And we see production benefits, which is great for producers. So we see increased mating activity days 1 through 5 after starting the trial. We see that there are more flies mating in the fed cages than there are mating in the water-only cages, and the decline takes longer to occur. They don't really start to decline until day 6 strongly, whereas we see that decline more at like day 3 or 2 even in the other condition. And they lay more eggs and start laying those eggs sooner. So obviously mating is an energetically expensive activity. Having carbohydrates available can help flies mate for longer and maybe start sooner or mate more. Similarly, laying eggs is a really protein expensive activity. So having protein available may be what's responsible for increasing the number of eggs laid and making it that females start laying eggs sooner in our fed conditions compared to our water only conditions. So about fourfold the number of eggs laid in fed conditions compared to water only. So, what's one thing that would benefit black soldier flies or improve black soldier fly welfare? Feeding them. It increases their longevity, it allows for natural foraging behaviors, it improves mating and egg production. Importantly, there have been some other studies that have come out looking at different proteins, and it just shows that the dietary components really matter. And so, not just feeding them, but feeding them things that are good for them is going to be what improves their welfare and also gets you those concomitant productivity benefits. Now, different species of insects have different welfare concerns on farms. So I told you mealworms are another commonly farmed species, so are crickets. There are some things, just like with vertebrate livestock, that are in common, like inhumane slaughter across these species, but there are also things that are species specific, like shipping sickness in crickets, cannibalism in mealworms, or unfed adults in black soldier flies. So we do need to take a species specific and a life stage specific approach to the welfare of these farmed animals and to the welfare of insects more broadly. If you're interested in reading about any of those welfare concerns or recommendations, you can find them in this trio of publications that are in the Journal of Insects as Food and Feed. Okay, last example we're going to talk about is insect welfare in research settings, which as an insect researcher myself, who also, like I mentioned, works on humane slaughter, I use a lot of insects working on insects farmed at scale. And so I'm really interested in what we can be doing to improve our practices over time in our lab and in other labs in research settings. So insects can be subjected to a variety of low welfare practices in research as a result of experiments, like directly as a result of experiments, or just as a result of husbandry decisions. This includes things like lethal collection involving drowning or suffocation. It involves starvation, desiccation, invasive procedures, which are often performed without anesthesia, things like probe absorption, hemolymph draws, vivisection, disease trials, pesticide trials, aversive learning. There are many others. And husbandry can also sometimes cause issues, high stocking densities, inadequate feed being provided, disease, inhumane culling techniques, neglect, etc. All of those are possible. Invasive procedures without pain management are very commonly reported in insects. A study from one of my postdocs looking at about 14,000 papers in 15 high-impact journals from 2004 to 2023 found that dissection as a method of death made up 26% of our overall study population, and only 17% of papers reporting dissection reported the use of any anesthetic or analgesic prior to engaging in that dissection, which means that at least in reporting, though we don't know that this is actually what's occurring, it's just what is reported to be occurring. It is reported that 83% of dissections are vivisections, live unanesthetized dissections of animals like you're seeing over here to the left. In addition, the majority of them that did report the use of an anesthetic or analgesic reported using one that is not recommended by veterinarians because it doesn't actually have pain relieving properties, although it can potentially induce unconsciousness. There's also just very little reporting on insect welfare broadly. We did in the same paper, we found that close to 0% of papers had any ethics statement at all, and 0% of them mentioned attempts at reduction in terms of the numbers of animals used, which is an important part of the 3 Rs for ethical animal use I'll talk about in a minute. And essentially what this suggests is just that our discipline may not be super thoughtful a priori about the possible welfare harms of our research. And so there may be chances to reduce unnecessary harms that we're not taking because we're not thinking about welfare before we start our studies. So thinking about welfare is as simple as this 3 Rs framework: replace, reduce, refine. It's standard practice in all vertebrate animal research. Replace, if you don't have to use a live animal, don't use a live animal. If you do have to use a live animal, then reduce the number of them that you have to use to the minimum required to achieve important, results of the effect size of interest, so the minimum number required for your experiment, and then refine, right? Once you've determined the minimum number of animals you can use to address your research question, then do what you can to optimize the protocol to be as minimally stressful as possible, knowing that there may always be stressors, but trying to minimize the impacts of those stressors or any pain. So these have been promoted as best practice, not just for welfare reasons, but also for conservation reasons. There's a great paper in Conservation Science and Practice that talks about the 3Rs as best practices for minimizing wild bee captures to support biological research on wild bee populations. I'd highly recommend you check out this paper where they go through 3 examples of replacement, 1 example of refining, 1 example of reduction. Another thing about this is just, an important thing for biological collections. Can the samples or specimens that you're collecting, including bycatch, actually be kept for reference or future studies so that they can reduce future animal use that other researchers might have needed to collect, but instead can use your samples? If you are interested also in a little bit more about reducing future animal use and its relationship to open science practices, I wrote about this with Jordan Cuff and some of the other folks at the Royal Entomological Society in Agriculture and Forest Entomology a few years ago. Essentially, high quality metadata and making data available is another way to help reduce future animal use to the minimum number of animals required. We also, at the Insect Welfare Research Society, are really interested in providing guidance to researchers that are trying to do more high welfare or think more about welfare in their research and experimental design. So we do have a refinement guide available here that we are updating actually as we speak and hope to have the new version out January 2026. But it essentially guides you through how to consider insect welfare before an experiment begins and how to monitor it during rearing and experimentation, including anesthetic agent, euthanasia method, and transportation device, and substantially more on rearing and husbandry. There are many ways that people are starting to advocate for changing methods and developing new methods that are non-invasive or less lethal. I would highly recommend checking out the 3Rs Principles in Wildlife Research website, which has some examples of that. There's also a great presentation that was given in our research seminar series at the Insect Welfare Research Society on the needs and means of using non-lethal methods in entomological research by Levy and Ferrante, who wrote a paper by a very similar name in Annual Reviews of Entomology last year. And if you're really interested, as I thought this group might be, on collecting specifically, this is actually a topic near and dear to my heart because I got my start in entomology collecting pollinators, and I was just out in the field like last week doing some research on pollinators. So we have some papers out on that, on ethical issues in lethal insect monitoring in the pollinator context and more broadly, as well as reflecting on collecting in entomology education exercises. So highly recommend you check out any of those papers if you have the time. Okay, so conclusions. If you fell asleep at the beginning and you're just waking up now, insects are a diverse, highly abundant group of animals. At least some of these animals are plausibly sentient, though there is still great scientific uncertainty and philosophical uncertainty. We should be cautious in our treatment of plausibly sentient animals to prevent potential and unnecessary harms. Insects are used or managed in the wild, on farms, and in research settings. A lot more research is needed to understand what kinds of changes to our best practices we need to do to ensure that we can reduce those unnecessary harms to these animals. And so in summary, what benefits bugs? Starting to consider their welfare in all of these use cases. With that, I want to thank the many, many collaborators and funders who helped to make this work possible. There was a tremendous number of people that went into the research that I just talked about, and I would be happy to take any questions.